Welcome to the Capital Forum's Antitrust Thought Leader Series. I'm Jeff Bliss, and today with me is George Cary, who's the senior partner with Cleary, Gottlieb, Hamilton. Thanks so much, George, for joining me today.
My pleasure, Jeff.
I want to really talk to you about, there's a lot of focus, certainly in the U.S., about all the changes and what people would say more aggressive enforcement of the DOJ and Federal Trade Commission. But that's not to say there isn't a lot going on in the rest of the world. And so I just wanted to talk with you about, since you were one of the primary defenders of Broadcom's VMware acquisition, which was obviously a very long, drawn-up process, with the fate of the deal was by no means predestined and preordained. If you could tell me a little bit in that experience what you've learned about outside the U.S., some of the what's going on in terms of the enforcement environment.
Yeah, it's a minefield out there, Jeff. It's increasingly complicated. It's increasingly a three-dimensional chess game. It's increasingly a situation where getting the substance right, getting the substance down, having all the facts, the law, the economics in place doesn't necessarily guarantee you that you're going to be able to close your deal in any kind of reasonable time period.
So are you, in your view, are you seeing what you would say in your mind, what is outside traditional antitrust enforcement is coming into the decisions of some of these other regulators?
Yeah, it depends on the jurisdiction, and it's an interesting situation. I mean, it used to be that you could rely on the U.S. to apply very well-known economic principles, which are embedded in the law, review the transaction on the merits, dialogue with you as you're going through the process, answering the questions, and getting done. That would then be the template for what went on in, let's say, Europe or other parts of the world. And it was relatively predictable. It would roll out in a predictable way. I think that model has been turned upside down. So today, you cannot necessarily count on the U.S. agencies focusing on the antitrust merits. You can't count on that economic framework. In fact, in some ways, we see that the rule of law is maybe a little more in place in other parts of the world. And then you've got all of the extraneous non-competition issues that come into play, some of which become obvious as you go along, some of which you never quite know what's driving the decision making. So it's a much more complicated process.
You brought up a lot there. Can you give any specific examples of like some of the issues that you're seeing now, and perhaps were part that came up during the Broadcom VMware review process?
Yeah, in the economic framework used to be one where everybody was on board with the notion of free trade. Everybody was on board with the notion of competitive markets. And the point of antitrust was circumscribed just to ensure that if there are market failures, they're taken care of. Today, I think antitrust is viewed in many parts of the world as a tool in their arsenal for bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations, economic competition writ large, nation versus nation, industrial policy, a whole series of inputs into the decision making that maybe touch tangentially on competition policy, but sometimes don't even touch, even in a minor way, on competition policy.
Well, and certainly as a journalist following Broadcom VMware, one of several at the Capitol Forum who did the coverage, it was impossible for us not to write stories, certainly when we were talking about China and Sammer's review of the deal, talking about export controls, talking about the trade tensions between the two countries. Is that I assume that's one of the issues you're talking about?
I think that's a good example of it. And it's a little bit ironic. When I was at the Federal Trade Commission a couple of decades ago, I was one of the first U.S. antitrust officials to go to China. And the point of that dialogue, this was before China became part of the World Trade Organization, the free trade countries, the competitive countries, the market countries, were encouraging China to adopt an antitrust law as being something that would open up the Chinese market and create a level playing field internationally and allow the free trade of goods. we've now seen a situation where the antitrust law is being used as a tool in the trade wars. It's being used as a way to add some leverage in trade negotiations completely unrelated to competition issues. And I think candidly that's what happened with the Broadcom deal. And that's not to say that the antitrust agency didn't focus on the antitrust issues. It's to say that other parts of the government have a say in whether the deal is approved and can hold up a deal for reasons unrelated to competition.
I can tell you, we were talking about this just beforehand. I said I never thought as you know, as an antitrust journalist, I would be and my colleagues would be writing about Broadcom CEO Hock Tan, where he was sitting at when President Xi from China was coming and had the reception. I think it was in San Francisco.
Yes.
Yeah, and but that was important for our readers to know that this was going on. So I mean, that's the type of thing you're saying is like we have to look at, you know, you aren't looking at it and what was previously a narrow set of considerations. It's, you know, writ large, it's like this bigger thing. Is that fair to say? In terms
That is fair to say. And you heard in the United States from President Biden on down, this whole of government approach to competition.
Of course, yeah.
Well, the Chinese are doing the same thing. They're doing a whole of government approach to economic policy, and they are now looking at antitrust and merger clearance as one tool in their toolbox to get a whole series of other agenda items promoted that have nothing to do with competition.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong. I remember this congressional commission that is like this semi-permanent commission that Congress set up to follow China. I remember reading a report from them, about 5 or 7 years ago, saying they might use this. Like this could be in the future. This would be leverage that obviously the Chinese would have, would be merger approval, review and approval. So that you're saying they're doing it. Right, that it's fully being enacted now.
Yeah, and it's not only China. I think it goes beyond China. You're seeing it in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, and I'm going to get to that in a second. We do want to point out your deal got through.
Yes, the deal got through. It took longer than would have been optimal, and you know that has its own impact. The benefits of the deal, the efficiencies that are generated, the business plan, the infusion of capital into the business.
Right.
It's a little ironic. You know, around the world, we see a focus, for example, on the hyperscalers, the big cloud companies. And antitrust concern has been expressed in all corners of the world about the hyperscalers and platforms and competition. Here is a deal that is going to bring new competition into the cloud market. It's going to allow customers to have more choices. It's going to improve data centers on premises and off premises and create a more cloud-like experience for companies that want to run their own clouds. And that whole process is held up and slowed down by antitrust clearance at the same time that the international agencies are looking at the cloud guys and saying, why isn't there more competition?
Right. And I also wanted to point out is that one of the reasons your deal got through too is because you kind of won the antitrust argument. I think the CMA actually came out and said you won it. We agree with you.
Yes.
And we put out a story saying that the FTC came to the so-called vertical math. The econometrics didn't work out for their case if they were going to bring one. And my understanding is also they didn't have a lot of witnesses who were going to testify.
Yeah.
So they didn't have it. So in some ways, is it fair also to say there was that? I mean, there was traditional antitrust where they basically said, no, we don't have a case here.
That's absolutely right. The only question is, why did it take so long to get to those conclusions?
Right. And
the CMA, I think, did an excellent job. They got to the bottom of it. The FTC scrutinized it up, down, every which way, as you know, and came to the conclusion that this deal is not going to be anti-competitive.
Yeah, case.
The question is, why did it take so long to get all of those approvals globally? And I think, this is an important point, and that's going to be increasingly a problem. For these deals to be held up for a year, 18 months, maybe even 2 years, through regulatory scrutiny, not only in the U.S. and Europe and China, but in the U.K., in Korea, in Japan, in Israel, in South Africa, in Brazil. It creates, it throws sand in the gears. It slows down economic progress. And on a deal where you're talking about big horizontal competitors in highly concentrated market, you might say, okay, there's a legitimate issue
Right.
that's worth slowing things down. On deals like Broadcom VMware, it's simply a drag on the economy. It's a drag on consumer benefits, and it's a reduction in competition to the extent that the assets are now going to be better deployed and are going to bring new competition for consumers. And that's a real problem.
You mentioned several regulators there that, frankly, we don't, as an organization, we're not as focused on. We're obviously focused on the big jurisdictions. You mentioned Korea. You mentioned Israel. You also mentioned Brazil. Can you tell me a little bit about, why don't we start with Korea? What's going on there? Why are the Koreans seem to be more aggressive now?
When you find out, Jeff, you can give me a call and let me know. I mean, we are seeing increasing friction, put it that way, in Korea. We are seeing a little bit more of a concern about whether there are other policy issues that are coming to play in their merger review process. It used to be very clearly defined. Here's the merger review process. If there are other issues related to competition, other issues related to non-competition factors, they're dealt with separately. We are starting to feel concern about whether the KFTC is focusing on the straight and narrow as they had previously done. We're seeing more situations where the KFTC has slowed down transactions, has taken more time than they used to take, and it's not exactly clear what it is that's driving that, and we're very concerned about it.
What are the issues that are coming up that weren't coming up in the past with the Korean?
I think they are just asking for more information. When you provide the answers to the questions in legitimate detail, they want to go another step deeper. The transaction is then held up and held up and held up. The timelines are not being adhered to as rigorously. And we're seeing that in a number of transactions where it seems like Korea is getting more conservative in terms of letting the deals go through that are not problematic, and the explanations are not entirely clear.
All right, so you're not seeing what the motivations are, but they're asking. It sounds like, well, their version of a second request is much broader than it used to be.
And it's repetitive, that you answer the question and then you hear the same question come up again, purportedly seeking more detail on the subject. Yes.
Would you say, I mean, it's well known that China and what's going to SAMR, that there's a lot of scrutiny there, and these things can be very extended, so on and so forth. I hadn't heard that about Korea. Are there other, let's just stay in that region of the world, other Asian countries where you're starting, or oceanic countries where you're starting to see more of this type of thing happen?
Yeah, I mean, obviously China is the big example. I think Korea is increasingly being looked at in a similar way. The real issue in a lot of these countries now is a wait and see attitude. So they do have their own filing requirements. You file, and then you hear very little. Sometimes the authority will expressly say, well, we want to see what Europe's going to do. We want to see what the U.S. is going to do. So some countries have statutory limits, some countries don't. Even those that have statutory limits can extend the clock by issuing requests for information. We're increasingly seeing jurisdictions playing the wait and see game, and that creates this musical chairs issue that you can't get traction until somebody decides, and no one is prepared to be the first to decide. And we're seeing that, again, I don't want to make this sound like this is xenophobic or foreign bashing. We're seeing that in the U.S. We're seeing the U.S. FTC agreeing to timelines and then extending those timelines. And they don't come out and say, we're waiting to see what Europe's going to do, but it's pretty clear they're waiting to see what Europe's going to do.
So in terms, like, one of the things we were talking about beforehand that is the job of the outside antitrust attorneys, the senior ones, is to essentially, I call it's basically conduct the orchestra in terms of to coordinate the different timelines on these regulatory things for, obviously, advising the emerging parties. So you said this is, I mean, that was already complicated. Now, I assume this has gotten even more complex. Can you tell us a little bit more about that process, that at least for in lay person's terms, not getting too much into the...
Yeah. So there are substantive issues and there are procedural issues. Substantive issues are around what is the competitive impact of the deal.
Right.
Whether it's a supplier-customer situation, a competitor-competitor situation, what are the competitive implications? It used to be that was pretty clear-cut how you would go about analyzing that. The U.S. FTC and DOJ have now injected a great degree of uncertainty around that. They have explicitly said we're no longer going to rely on the consumer welfare standard and economic analysis, which used to be the lodestar and provided predictability. So you have that going on. You have other jurisdictions in the world, European Union, the CMA, China, et cetera, that have largely followed that same institutional structure, which is you look at the competitive merits using economic frameworks. Some are hewing more closely to that. Others are going the path of the U.S. and saying we can consider other things. So substantively, it's gotten much more complicated. What will the agency consider? How do you demonstrate that those considerations shouldn't create a problem? And how do you sequence the rolling out of those substantive considerations? On the other hand, you have procedural issues. When do you have to file? Where do you have to file? Once you file, what time limits kick in? What are your obligations after you file? How long will the process take?
I can see, yeah.
And that is different in each jurisdiction as well. So you've got this puzzle that you have to solve in order to get the deal through. What is calculated to lead you to the quickest result? And again, then you overlay on top of that what we just talked about, where one agency is saying after you. Everybody's waiting to see what the other does, which then pushes things out further and further. So getting that timing done, getting the rollout substantively done, figuring out where you should approach which agency and when, and how that moves ahead can be pretty complicated.
And to be clear, what are some of the issues generally, maybe that you're hearing from the Israelis that you didn't hear before, from Kaje down in Brazil that you might have before? I mean, obviously here they've added several things that they're, I mean, one of the big things which did start, I started hearing about it more in the Trump administration, was labor monopsony issues.
Yeah.
These guys have taken it to a higher level. Is it that type of tying and bundling that's anti-competitive? Are those the type of issues you're hearing about in other jurisdictions, or are they coming up with something even different from that?
I think the tech issues are important in those other jurisdictions. I do think the Israeli example is definitely one of, we don't see an issue necessarily, but we haven't heard from the Europeans, and we'll outsource our analysis and see if they come back with something. But we also see that at the FTC. The FTC is prepared to say, we can't put a case together, but let's see what Europe does, and let's see if they come up with something. And this, I think, is part of the disconnect between the professional staff who does the analysis, is rigorous, looks at the facts, looks at the law, comes to a conclusion, but then has to answer to a skeptical political group at the top who are saying, we don't think you guys have been doing this right historically, so we're not necessarily trusting in your conclusion. But the Europeans historically have been more aggressive, so let's see if they come up with something, and if they do, then we'll come ask you why you didn't come up with it.
Well, and it's also, there, as you pointed out, they have different processes. Let's face it. If
Yes.
the EC says this deal, we want to prohibit it, yeah, sure, you can go to the court there, but it essentially kills the deal, because it's just that it takes too long. Whereas here, you do get your day in court, and in several courts in some cases, depending on what you're doing. So, and to be fair, like in terms of what's going, is it fair to say also in the past, I have noticed that DOJ and FTC in different administrations have taken advantage of, like, well, it looks like the European Commission is going to do this. Why don't we, we know these guys can't close, so we're just going to simply keep going. Is that is that you've seen that before, I assume, right?
Yes.
But is it fair to say what they're doing now is kind of, in your view, much more like to the putting it on 11 in terms of doing that, right?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I think that
Okay.
that is the issue. You described it very well, and I think it's really it's an abdication of U.S. leadership and U.S. responsibility, in my mind. I mean, it used to be that the FTC or the DOJ were the gold standard. They would review a transaction, they'd review it on the merits, they'd come to their decision, and they would provide that leadership. Today, you can convince the professional staff at the agencies, and then you're on hold. And the notion is the opposite of providing leadership. The notion is, well, we kind of don't like mergers generally, so if the Europeans block it, that's fine with us, even though their own staff has determined there's not a problem. And I think it goes back to some fundamentals. It goes back to a fundamental lack of regard for the free market allocating these assets. There's a sense that mergers are bad. And you have to convince us, and you have to be really persuasive to convince us that your merger is not part of the problem. I think that's an unfair way to think about it. In a capitalistic free market, assets should go where they have their highest and best use. Part of that process of moving assets where they serve consumers best is the M&A process. And a notion that M&A is all bad, so if we slow it down, not a problem, which if not expressed, is at least is implicit in the way many of these international agencies are working, I think is a real drag on prosperity and on consumer welfare and on the economy.
And I want to get back to the international aspect, because that I think is a very interesting in terms of our discussion here. Would it be? Is it? You're saying like they've been made no bones about it in this administration. They don't think the consumer welfare standard it's over in their mind.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah.
Do you see it as possible that things are, every once in a while you have these sea changes in antitrust, that we had it in the early 80s, obviously. And certainly when we're writing about this, we say that we haven't seen something like this in 4 decades. It's always that seems to be like since 1981 or whatever. So are we undergoing another sea change now, which meaning this is something that's durable? And 2, is it a resetting where this will eventually settle, where this will be these new parameters that people will say, well, it's not consumer welfare standard, but here's the new list. Do you imagine that happening, or do you think like, no, it's just going to be a free-for-all in your mind?
Boy, that's a great question, Jeff. I'm going to go out on a limb.
Okay.
I'm going to say it's not a sea change.
Okay.
And I'm going to say it for the following reasons. And maybe I'll bring in a little historicism here.
Yeah.
If you look back at the last sea change, what happened was, obviously, post-World War II, there was this big concern about consolidation and monopolies and mergers in general, and they amended the law to make it tighter on different types of merger transactions. You get into the late 60s, early 70s, you see the Hart-Scott-Rodino process. We're missing a bunch of mergers. All of that is in the context of a domestic market which had consolidated. Competition seemed to be diminished. You had 3 car companies, for example. Right. Studebaker goes out of business. Kaiser goes out of business. You've got the big 3. They're coordinating. This is a problem. That was the mindset. Along comes Datsun, if you remember that name.
Of course, yeah, of course.
Along comes Toyota, and then comes Honda. Emblematic of international competition and free trade in the world. And now all of a sudden, GM is no longer the boogeyman that it used to be. GM is in a little bit of trouble. Right. And the question becomes, well, wait a minute. We've got this antitrust body of law that was built up with just a knee-jerk consolidation's bad, challenging a grocery store in LA that's got a 2% market share being acquired by another with a 3% market share. This can't be right. Let's think through what the implications of this are. That's where the Reagan Revolution, if you want to call it that, but that's not really fair. I mean, even the Carter administration,
Was starting-
economic analysis was being brought to bear, deregulation
Yes,
brought to bear,
that's right. Yeah.
rethinking merger control brought to bear.
Beginning, yeah.
It was responding to this global environment of competition and trade coming from all kinds of sources, reformed the system. That led to 40 years that we've seen of growth, international competition, prosperity, GDP growth, et cetera. So the question is, where are we now with respect to this? And is the fundamental underlying economic conditions so different that we need to reevaluate this? The drivers seem to be the high-tech areas, the platforms, et cetera. But I'm not seeing this as something that should undermine the economic analysis that underlays, antitrust. These concerns about labor, these concerns about political power, I think those are extraneous to competition, and I think they're ultimately going to be negative. We're seeing inflation rising. Inflation is a situation that can be ameliorated through more efficient production, more goods for the same dollar. That is what competition is all about. And I think we have to go back to thinking through what the implications are of loading all of these other policies onto competition. The attack on free trade, I think, is kind of the same thing. And to the extent that countries use antitrust as a way to barricade their markets, as opposed to opening up the markets, which was the original vision, I think it's a real problem.
Yeah, and this is a segue into seeing more from the international side.
Yeah.
In your mind, do you believe that some of these non-U.S. regulators are using antitrust? Certainly, the Chinese were accused of this, not necessarily just in your deal, but in several deals, of using this policy as leverage, perhaps for national champions, or to perhaps as retaliation against something they didn't. If they're U.S. companies, that they retaliate against them, or perhaps as leverage in terms of the negotiations on export controls. Do you believe that's going on?
Yeah, I do believe that's going on.
Okay.
And I believe that's going to be part of the problem, because you end up in a situation where it's just not plausible. With all of these countries in the world, some of them having only tangential interest in the particular transaction, having to review it and approve it. You then have the big bloc countries, China, Europe, the United States, that are using it for, again, ancillary purposes. And then I think the big issue here, or a big issue here, is I think the U.S. has kind of abdicated the leadership position in terms of holding people accountable for maintaining the focus on competition of antitrust and not using antitrust in that way. If the U.S. is prepared to inject all kinds of political or ideological issues into competition, that gives China license to do the same, Korea license to do the same. That's going to be the problem going forward. The U.S. needs to get its house in order, and then it needs to hold other people accountable, other countries accountable, to using merger clearance for its intended purpose, not for all of these other ancillary purposes.
Well, let me ask you. Let's imagine what the administration might say. I'm not defending or whatever, going on either side of this, but I think certainly if you had Jonathan Cantor and Lena Khan in the room, they said, well, hey, we're not doing the export controls. And we certainly weren't the people in the Trump administration that were very hawkish on China. Is it fair to say that there is this, to the side there, it's been going on for years, this tension building against what you said, the kind of the free trade agreements that obviously has rocked politics in this country, but also around the world? Is that, even if you went back to in your view, like the consumer welfare standard, would it be fair to say there would still be these other pressures still on the process?
There would still be the other pressures, but they would be in their own lane. So if the issue is trade negotiations, you can have the USTR and the Commerce Department dealing with their counterparts in Afghanistan, whatever country you want to pick, and they would be negotiating that, and everybody would know where we stand. That is different from exercising leverage through the merger clearance process to accomplish an unrelated goal. And my point with respect to the U.S. is not that Lina Khan is creating trade barriers. That's not my point. My point is that to the extent that the FTC is prepared to say considerations other than competition can play a part in merger review, the U.S. then loses the moral high ground to say to China, you're going off in the wrong direction by having your merger control be influenced by trade policy. And you need to get your house in order, confine merger control to competition issues, and let the trade track work out its issues on the trade track. That's where I think there's a problem. Historically, the U.S. has taken that role. The U.S. has proselytized that competition ought to be a matter of law and economics based on competition issues, not these extraneous concerns. And at this point, ironically, it's the European Union, Margrethe Vestager, who is staking out that position, that yes, consumer welfare is the standard. Yes, this is a legal process. No, it's not a political process. That used to be the gold standard that everybody aspired to, including the Chinese, for example.
Okay, and would it be fair to say, certainly if you had Chair Khan or again, DOJ Antitrust Chief Kaner in this room, they would say, well, that's not our position at all. What you say is not competition. We see that it's this different definition from the consumer welfare standard is our definition of competition, the way we should look at competition. Is that fair to say that's kind of the response you're getting when you're dealing with the agencies? I want to make do that be fair?
Well, when we're dealing with the professional staff at the agencies, I think it's still a very professional process. I think they are still looking at the economics and the law and trying to figure out what the real competitive impact will be. The place where it gets off track is in the policy pronouncements, where there is a focus on things that are not related to these competition issues. And that's where I think the lack of moral authority will come into play.
All right, but would it be, it doesn't sound like you probably have too much hope that they're going to see things your way in this administration. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say.
Okay, fair enough. Well, this is obviously an ongoing discussion, and I appreciate the time and your views on all this, George. Thanks so much for coming.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.